Welcome back to the Quantum Yoga Podcast. I'm so excited to have microbiologist Kiran Krishnan on the program. And it's funny, I've been watching a lot of your webinars, and it's frequently you're introduced as everyone's favorite microbiologist. And so that's certainly true for me. Well, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's, I think maybe one of the reasons I have that designation is because I'm a microbiologist that can talk to humans. A lot of them are a little too nerdy to be able to socialize and engage with humans well. And so being able to engage this kind of complex information in a digestible way, no pun intended, is something that I feel I could do fairly well.
Well, that is most of our topic today. We're going to be talking about the microbiome, of which you're a specialist, have been working in this field for a long time, and sort of just the gut really as a big thing. And I just want to cue people up that they can get a ton of great information, presentations and webinars and product information on the Microbiome Labs YouTube channel. Yeah. You guys are so prolific with your education, and I appreciate that. Thank you. So where I'd like to start is if we could do sort of a top-down approach of the gut, getting to the microbiome, because this is becoming so popular among sort of non-scientists now who are interested that clearly this is important, but I think it's also loosely used in some ways where people don't really know where the microbiome is, and kind of the components of the GI system that are involved in that. And so could you maybe start there, paint a little anatomical picture for us?
Yeah, so that's really important. So let's define what microbiome is in the first place. So the microbiome really is a big, all-encompassing term that basically defines all of the microbes. So these are bacteria, viruses, protozoas, amoebas, almost anything, fungus that lives in and on your body. So all of the organisms, and then all of their genetic elements as well. So all of their DNA, RNA, proteins, all of the things that seem to play a role in our day-to-day function. So that entire encompassing ecosystem is called a microbiome. And it's not actually subjected to any one part of the body. You actually have microbiomes in all parts of your body: your skin, your eyes, your urogenital tract, your bladder, your gut, every aspect of your gut, your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestines, your large intestines, even your blood. We used to think the old ideas of the urine being sterile, right? And we used to think blood is sterile. Blood is not sterile. You actually have, for every milliliter of blood that you have, you've got about 1,000 bacteria cells in there. And we each have about 5,500 milliliters of blood. So we have a lot of bacteria swimming around in our blood. There's a recent study showed that in our cerebral spinal fluid, which we never thought there would be microbes there, is loaded with viruses and bacteria and all kinds of living organisms, right? So there's no part of your body that is sterile. There's almost no part of your body that has no collective ecosystem in it. And so the best way to really understand the microbiome is to redefine what a human being actually is. We think of ourselves as this collection of organ systems. We have a heart, a brain, a lungs, your pancreas, your kidneys, all of these organ systems, your skin, and all of that is connected by vessels and neurons and tissue. And collectively, we are this walking, talking structure. But really what we are is something called a holobiome. A holobiome is a superorganism, right? We are a collection of thousands of organisms that all have to work in concert with all of these little microecologies all over the body. And in order for us to do well and to function as a human, all of these little microecologies have to communicate and work together. And that, essentially we are a walking, talking rainforest is what we are. And so we have to kind of understand and respect that complex ecology that we're basically made out of. So the microbiome encompasses all of that. Now, the vast majority of the bacteria and organisms in general that live in and on our body live in the digestive tract. So starting in the mouth, in the stomach where there's few organisms, but there are organisms. And part of that is because the stomach is extremely acidic and doesn't, most organisms can't handle that acid environment. And then the upper part of the GI, so that's called the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum or duodenum, as some cultures would say. Some areas call it duodenum. That also has a lower number of microorganisms because there's something called bile salts, and bile salts act as a strong antimicrobial. So there's some specialized bacteria that live there. And then as you move down the small intestine, which is about 20, 22 feet or so, the number of bacteria start to increase and the diversity of bacteria start to increase. Then finally, when you get into the colon or the large intestine, that has the highest number of microbes. You've got hundreds of billions, in fact, hundreds of trillions of bacteria in the colon and up to 1,000 different species that live there. So, just think of starting from the mouth, moving all the way down to the rectum, you get this really interesting striation of increasing number of bacteria with increasing complexity of function as well. But then remember that every part of your body is covered with microbes, and all of those microbes play a significant role in what happens to that part of the body, like skin, for example. Whether or not you have acne, dermatitis, eczema, a lot of that is controlled by the microbiome in the gut, which then controls the types of microbes that live on your skin, and then your outcomes of your skin are dictated by those microbes on your skin. So everything is controlled by microbes, essentially.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that redefines it for me. I didn't realize the amount that was in blood and CSF. I was just thinking about basically the surfaces that interface with the world around us, That's incredible. So can you say then that the area of the highest density of this microbiome population is HQ for the whole system? Or in other words, is it this hierarchical in its sort of structure? Or do you think that there's sort of independent governing of the different systems?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because those are some of the things we're trying to figure out with, when you have a condition that's outside of the gut in other parts of the body, how influential is the gut and what's happening with the gut microbiome in those aspects of disease or health or wellness or whatever you're looking at peripheral to the gut. And basically what it comes down to is it seems like the central command system is in the gut. Right, so the gut, which encompasses both your small intestine and large intestine, the microbiome there is the most dense, the most complex, and the most functioning, really. And then here's the part that really allows it to influence the rest of the body, is that the microbiome in the gut has direct access to the brain. It's a two-way street to the brain, so it can influence hormone production, neurotransmitter production. It can influence responses that the brain would typically conduct to the rest of the body. And then it also covers about 80% of the immune system. So about 80% of your immune tissue is actually found in your gut. So the central command for your immune system exists in the gut, and that is controlled largely by the bacteria in the gut. So the HQ would be in the gut. And more we're coming to understand that all other parts of the body are significantly influenced by what's happening in the gut. If you're somebody that gets lots of bacterial vaginosis or yeast infections in other parts of the body, or chronic upper respiratory infections or sinus infections, all of these things are dictated by what's happening in the gut, and the gut controls a lot of that immune response.
When you paint it that way, it almost seems like we're just here serving a larger master, of this whole ecosystem that's kind of built up the human in a way, or built up other animals and higher organisms to serve out a larger purpose.
Yeah.
And then so it begs the question, and I should pause here and let you know, I explore areas of neuroscience and consciousness with other guests and scientists. And part of what I'm trying to do here is understand where things may be connecting. And I heard you talk once about the role of consciousness and the function of the gut, largely relationship to emotions. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and if you are aware of any interesting work going on in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at emotions, of course, when you break it down from to the chemical perspective, our emotions are dictated a lot by the types of neurotransmitters and hormones that are produced. We know serotonin, the happy hormone, dopamine that functions in the reward centers of the brain. There's a whole host of stress hormones that can affect our behavior, outcome, and even our outlook on life. In fact, one of the first studies that was done on the impact of the microbiome on emotions, consciousness, cognitive behavior, function was a study on fermented dairy products that were giving to women. And what they were able to show is that when they consumed these fermented dairy products for a period of time, then they could, versus a group that was not given that same fermented dairy product, and then they would show them stressful pictures and they would monitor their brainwave function. They found that the women that were consuming what would be considered kind of probiotic fermented product actually had a better outlook by measured brainwave function when seeing those stressful pictures, meaning they dealt with the stress much better. And in general, looking at other outcome measures, they had a better outlook on life in general, compared to the ones that didn't. And so, and we know that there are bacteria in your gut that make you more altruistic. We know that there are bacteria in your gut that actually enhance social behavior among people. And the question may be, well, why would a bacteria do that? Why would a bacteria make you want to hug people more or make you want to go out and socialize more? What's in it for the bacteria? Well, they're not doing it purely for your benefit. They're actually doing it for their benefit as well, because one of the ways that microbes continue to survive is by being transferred from host to host. So the closer the interaction is with other people, we will end up transferring these bacteria to some degree to other people that we come in close contact with. So we know that there's a significant impact on your outlook on life, on your ability to socialize, the way you interact with other people based on the bacteria that exists in your system. Now, the converse is true as well. There are microbes in your system that can trigger significant panic and anxiety type of response. For example, Campylobacter. Campylobacter is a foodborne pathogen. Typically in a poultry pathogen. So if you get a Campylobacter infection, one of the main side effects of a Campylobacter infection is all of a sudden onset of severe anxiety and panic, and that's the bacteria causing that. And one of the interesting ties there is that you're trying to figure out why would a bacteria make you do that? Well, in part because it is changing things in the gut to induce diarrhea, right? And one of the reasons why it's inducing diarrhea is because it's trying to slough off its competition, the other microbes that it's competing for with space. So it's hanging on, it's inducing diarrhea, and then when you defecate, a lot of the bacteria that's living in your mucus layer gets washed out, and that gives this bacteria more real estate to take hold. And part of its toxin producing that causes this diarrhea also causes panic and anxiety. We know that when we are anxious and we are afraid, our bowel movements get affected, right? So it's completely connected. So a lot of how we view the world, of how we deal with stress, of our emotional outlook comes down to the types of microbes that are living in your gut.
It's fascinating. Back to the anatomy. And one of the things I've become increasingly interested in is the gut lining. As far as I understand, this is where the enteric nervous system lives. It's where that 80% of our immune system lives. Correct me if I'm wrong here. And this is one of the primary interfaces between the microbiome and the rest of the body. And the health of that gut lining and its sort of integrity, for lack of a better word, is of the utmost importance. And can you speak to that?
Yeah, so it's really great that you bring that up, because that is what we call the ground zero of basically every health disorder. Outside of a significant genetic mutation that a person might have, so they have a congenital defect that leads to a particular disease, most of the things we're all concerned of, the chronic illnesses we're concerned of, things like, cancer and diabetes and obesity and heart disease and autoimmune disease and emotional disorders and gastroesophageal reflux disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all of these kind of conditions, the things that affect 98, 99% of the population, all of those can be traced back to some dysfunction in the gut lining. And, it begs the question, why? Why is that gut lining so critical? Well, when you look at the physiology behind it, the gut lining is an interface between the outside of the body components and the inside of the body, right? We used to think of our skin, our outside skin, as the barrier between us and the outside world. Well, it's not actually true, because we have lots of orifices, especially the oral orifice, where lots of things enter on a daily basis, things we don't even know of, contaminants that we've touched, and we touch our face and mouth and they get in, or things that are on our food and on our beverages that we drink that we're not even aware are present on those things, like mold toxins and viruses and viral components and prions, all of these exotic things that we are constantly consuming. All have to go through the digestive system, and as it's going through the digestive system, it's actually still considered to be outside of your body. So if you think of the intestinal tract as a tube, the inner part of the tube, the hole in the tube, is called a lumen. So anything that's going through the hole in the intestine, which is the tube part, is actually outside of the body still, because it doesn't have access to the blood system, right? The circulatory system. Now, as it starts to get closer to the walls of the intestines, that's when we start to get into that threshold. And that threshold is made up, which we call collectively the intestinal lining, is made up of a couple of really critical components. The first part is a very thick and complex mucus layer. That mucus layer is the site of action for everything that happens, and I'll elaborate on that in a second. But below that mucus layer, a little bit deeper into the lining of the intestinal wall, is the epithelial cells. Those are your intestinal cells that line and separate the blood system from the mucus layer. And then among those epithelial cells are a whole bunch of immune cells, like M cells and L cells and goblet cells that produce the mucus, and so on. So the basic structure is this mucus layer, and then below that mucus layer is your intestinal cell line, and then below the intestinal cell line is what we call the basolateral circulation. If things get past the mucus layer and past the line of cells, then it's entering into your blood. That's when it's inside the body, right? So that threshold of the mucus layer and the gut lining, the cells that make up the gut lining, are the barrier to the outside world. And very few things that we come in contact with should actually penetrate through that and enter into the circulatory system. And that's where all of the dysfunction occurs. Now, the other part of it is, in that mucosal structure, there's a very complex immune system working all the time, because it's the job of that immune system to figure out all of the stuff that you're coming in contact with, and try to figure out what it should attack and what it shouldn't attack. Imagine that mucus layer, the very top part of the mucus layer, is covered with your microbiome. So that's where your microbiome exists in this whole structure. So think of the intestines as a tube, like think of a straw or a pipe. The hole in the intestine where the stuff goes through is the lumen. If you go one layer into the lumen, it's the top part of the mucus layer, and that's where all of the microbes in your microbiome live. You go a little bit deeper, there's an inner part of the mucus layer, which is relatively sterile. There should be very few, if any, microbes in that area. And then as you go one more step deeper, you've got your intestinal cells, the lining of the cell, which make up your intestinal lining. And then if you go past that intestinal lining, then you're in the circulation. So we can trace back most diseases, most chronic illnesses, to some sort of breakdown in the mucus structure and in the intestinal lining. And when those things break down, what happens is toxins and inflammatory compounds that are not supposed to be entering into your circulation are allowed to leak through and enter into circulation on a regular basis. When it enters into circulation on a regular basis, every day as we walk, talk, eat, and breathe, then what's happening is it's inducing systemic inflammation in the body. So all of those toxins that are supposed to be barred from entry by the mucus layer and by the intestinal cell lines are allowed to enter, and because they're now in the circulatory system, it causes this non-specific chronic inflammation, which becomes the foundation of most of those disorders. And then there are specific toxins when are allowed to migrate through into the circulatory system, can actually specifically target particular parts of the body, like the brain, the nervous system, your joints, and so on, causing inflammation in those areas and then causing damage to those tissues. Now, when the immune system is trying to function and protect you from all of these things that are non-specifically coming through, if that is happening on a chronic basis, the immune system kind of goes haywire and you become stuck in this inflammatory type of immune response. And that's what triggers and leads to all of the immune dysfunctions, like simple things like allergies, asthma, psoriasis, eczema, all the way to more complex and scary things like autoimmune disease, like lupus and Hashimoto's and so on. So everything is becoming dysfunctional starting in that lining, because that is the barrier between us and the outside world. So if you think of your body as your house, and you've got a bunch of toxicity outside of the house, if your walls become porous and broken, the problems you're going to see inside the house is due to the dysfunction of that barrier. So that's why it's so important. And the number of studies now that have shown the variety of diseases that can be traced back to that barrier dysfunction is really staggering. And some of them I mentioned in the beginning, things as varied as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, or GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, or clinical depression, or obesity, heart disease, diabetes. All of these things, virtually every cancer we can think of, all of these things can be traced back to that dysfunction in the gut lining.
Would it be safe to say that if that was very well intact and operating the way that it should be, you can have a lot of nefarious pathogens in the microbiome with little to no impact?
Absolutely. Not only can you have lots of pathogens in the microbiome, but you can be exposed to a lot of toxic things and have the resilience to ward them off, because that's your basic defense mechanism. It's no different than that house I talked about. If the walls are thick and strong, then the things that are outside the house aren't really going to impact you on the inside much. And so, there are some people that, for example, can smoke all their lives and never develop lung cancer. There are some people that can eat junk food all their lives and never develop heart disease or cancer. And then there are others that, even though they're relatively careful, have high risk of developing all of these conditions. So the ability to be resilient is in large part dictated by the integrity and the function of those barrier systems. And it's important to note that this mucosal structure that I talked about in your gut is actually everywhere in your body. So every orifice in which something can enter your body, whether it's through your eyes, your ears, your nose, your urogenital tract, your skin, all of those orifices, the first thing that that foreign object or organism comes in contact with is a mucus layer. And that mucus layer is in fact 150 times greater in surface area than your outer dermal skin layer. We used to always think of the skin as the largest organ in the body, right? But the mucus layer is far larger and more complex and covers more of your body. And so it is the site of action for how your body responds to the world around you. And whether or not you're resilient or you're very susceptible to things is determined by how your mucus layer is structured, how your barrier system is structured, and all of that is determined by how it is structured in the gut.
And tell us then, how it gets dysfunctional and broken down, and what one could do about it.
Yeah, and so it really comes down to where things go wrong, right? When you start to look at the physiological structures of that important mucus layer, and then the physiological structures of those intestinal cells, we call them so the intestinal cell lines. I call them soldier cells because they kind of sit shoulder to shoulder. It's one cell thick. It's not a multicellular level. It's actually only one cell thick soldier cells sitting next to each other, acting as a barrier. If things get through the mucus layer, then they're the last, line of defense. The physiological structures with those are largely controlled by the bacteria that live in the top part of the mucus layer. So the microbiome determines how thick, and how well formed your mucus layer is, and it also communicates with the immune cells that are in the mucus layer about what's happening outside of the mucus layer. And so a lot of that communication is dictated by the microbes that live there. Now, the intestinal cells also, and when they become defunct and get kicked out or die, the ability to replace them quickly so there isn't a hole in the cell lining is also dictated in large part by the microbiome that lives on the top layer. So think about, this as a house. If you have a 2-story house, you've got the top of the house, which is a roof, and then you've got the second floor of the house, which is the mucus layer, and then the bottom floor of the house, which is your intestinal cells. And then all of the important people in the house are in the basement or on the bottom floor, which is underneath that intestinal cells. So then the people guarding the house are on the roof, and that's the microbiome. The people that build the house and repair the house and fix all the damage that occurs are on that roof, and they are the microbiome. So all of this dysfunction starts with perturbing that microbiome. So how do we perturb that microbiome? Well, the most common way that all of us have experienced is a single course of antibiotics. And I don't want to slam antibiotics completely because they do save lives, and there are many instances where antibiotics are necessary in order to save a life, but they're also widely overused, right? So even the CDC, a very conservative research organization, estimates that at least 50% of antibiotic prescriptions are unnecessary, especially in kids. They're given for viral infections and things that antibiotics wouldn't actually work for. And then, of course, there's the antibiotic abuse, where people either overuse them or underuse them, meaning you're given a 10-day course of antibiotics and you just take the first 3 days. After you feel better, after the first 3 days, people forget. And then what that does is it creates a significant perturbation in the first few days, and then all of a sudden you remove the antibiotic, and then the more resistant strains end up growing back much faster than the other ones. So you create these severe perturbations. Studies show that a 7-day course of clindamycin can mess up your microbiome for up to 2 years, right? So that's how significant it is. And that's assuming you've only taken one course. Now, the other things that continuously mess up the microbiome are the herbicides and pesticides that we are all exposed to in our environment, especially the Roundup stuff. And the problem with the Roundup stuff is it selectively kills good bacteria and allows for the proliferation of dysfunctional or problematic bacteria. So it causes this perturbation. Then, of course, processed foods with all the preservatives in it and antimicrobial compounds. Our water has chloride and fluorine in it, which are both antimicrobials. And then people, of course, sterilize their homes as well. Studies show that households that use chlorine-based cleaners have kids with higher incidence rates of asthma and allergies and other immune dysfunctions because the environment is too sterile. So we're not getting any exposure to the bacteria that we need to get exposed to. So all of these things in our modern living create a significant antimicrobial effect, which ends up killing or harming or creating significant dysfunction in the microbiome. And those are the protectors at the top of the house. Once the microbiome is dysfunctional, then they cannot protect the disruption within the mucosal structure and the intestinal cell lines as well. So you can see that progressively, that when you take a course of antibiotics or something to perturb the microbiome, the next thing that starts to break down is the mucus structure, because the important bacteria that help regenerate the mucus structure are gone, or their levels are too low and they can't regenerate the mucus structure. When you break down the mucus structure, what happens is you get toxins migrating into the mucus, causing an amplification of an immune response in that mucus structure. That inflammatory immune response in the mucus structure further disrupts the mucus structure and then starts harming the intestinal cell lines as well. So this is progressive, but it all starts with a dysfunction in the gut bacteria itself. So, and again, our environment does that for us.
I have heard that when someone does take a course of antibiotics, that the sort of weaker or more fragile strains tend to die off first, and the more minority strains tend to die off. Is that true? And would that mean then, especially for childbearing women, would that mean then, in a way, you're passing on fewer and fewer species in disproportionate amounts as one continues to bear children?
Yeah, it's a layering effect, right? So what tends to happen when you take a course of antibiotics is with each dose that you take, it actually brings down the total microbiome, basically all of the species, by about 99%,
Uh,
right? So everything gets knocked down together. Now, the problem is that there's a very specific environment in the gut, right? For example, in a really healthy gut, you should have really low levels of ammonia, and the pH should be relatively low. It's more acidic than basic, right? Because there are all of these bacteria in the gut that are really important commensal bacteria that produce lactic acid. And that lactic acid continuously maintains a lower pH in the gut. So if you imagine all of the bacteria die at once, and they all come down, which means that the lactic acid production is gone. And now the pH in the gut starts to increase. And so in this new environment, the bacteria that do well in a higher pH tend to grow back faster. So then, even though they all come back, eventually, they come back in very different proportions. And so that's where you start to get that significant perturbations. So now repeated doses then of antibiotics means that the new population is even more perturbed each time. And so, 7 days later, after 7 courses of antibiotics, or, whether it's 14 or 21 courses, depending on the type of antibiotic you take, that continuous bringing down of the total population and then a fight for those bacteria to come back will end up leading to this ecology that's completely dysfunctional from the original. So all of the players are still there. The important players are just at such a low level now that they're almost non-functional. Right? So when we look at things like the diversity in the microbiome, there are 2 major factors to diversity in the microbiome. One is richness in the microbiome, which speaks to the number of species that are found there. And then the second one is uniformity. And uniformity is very, very important as well. So you could have a rich microbiome, meaning you have lots of different bacteria, but if your uniformity is off, then you have dysbiosis, meaning you have a handful of strains that are predominant and many of your beneficial strains are there, but at just such a low dysfunctional level that they're not really providing the functions and protections that they typically afford. So that's what happens with antibiotic use, especially repeated use, is the microbiome keeps coming back, but every time it comes back, it's more and more perturbed.
Mm-hmm. If we can go one level deeper here in our microscope and talk about some of the components of the microbiome, what are some of the organisms that live there? I know a lot of the world that you're working with is in the world of bacteria, but there are other ones as well, and they all kind of have unique and specialized interactions with one another. What is the makeup of the microbiome look like?
Yeah, and so we're still at the tip of the iceberg in the microbiome, right? So more and more we're coming to see that there's a huge variety of organisms there. Of course, bacteria are the predominant organisms in the microbiome, but beyond bacteria, you have native fungus that live in the microbiome. So like Candida, for example, most people have heard of Candida. And you think of Candida as being bad, but they're a normal part of your commensal flora. It's when your system is off that they're allowed to overgrow. They are opportunistic in that sense. But you've got a significant number of fungus. I mean, you have up to 200 different types of Candida within the microbiome. You've got parasites that are normal in the microbiome, worms, and all different types of parasites, which are normal functioning components of the microbiome. You've got, of course, viruses. There are loads and loads of viruses in the microbiome. There's a whole thing called a virome, which is which is a term that encompasses the population of viruses that live in the microbiome. There are things like protozoas, and amoebas, so multicellular, single cellular organisms, and then probably things we haven't even discovered yet. We know that, during the mad cow disease scare, if you guys remember that, there was this organism, a very, very strange organism called a prion, which was basically just like a single strand of protein, and it can cause severe dysfunction. But with that in mind, there are likely beneficial prions that also live in the gut and in the body somewhere. And then there are phages, and phages are a type of virus that specifically target bacteria. So the complexity of the living system in the microbiome is far deeper and far greater than our current understanding. A lot of the focus has been on the bacteria because they are the largest part of the population. But as we dig more, we come to find out that there's some very exotic and complex creatures in the gut. We may even find never before seen living organisms anywhere on Earth. We might find them in our guts. We just don't know what to look for right now. Because we don't even know what they are. So it's a really, really fascinating and amazing space. But what we do know is the ecology of the microbiome does dictate health. And there are some things that we already understand well about what a healthy ecology looks like. And those are the things that we're kind of focused on.
Other than eliminating some of these major offenders and using them, we'll say antibiotics judiciously, what can one do to, if they were adding something, right, rather than eliminating, what could one do?
Yeah, so our focus was on, and has been over the last 10 years, are on the characteristics of a healthy microbiome that are well defined. It's hard to define characteristics of a healthy microbiome because everybody's microbiome is different, right? So what may look dysfunctional in your microbiome may be completely normal in my microbiome, because we all have a very different distribution of bacteria and their relative abundance. So for example, if you and I did a genetic test on our chromosomal DNA, our human DNA, we would probably be 99%, if not 99.5% similar, or identical. But if we did a test on our microbiome to compare the differences between our microbiome, we would probably find we are at best 50% similar. Our microbiomes can be that different. And because everyone's microbiome is different, it's hard to understand exactly what is a healthy and what's not a healthy microbiome. But there are a couple of things that have held true through a decade of microbiome research that have proven to be part of a healthy microbiome. The first one is a diverse microbiome. So the higher the diversity in your microbiome, the more resilient it is to infection, the more functions it can perform, the more it protects the host against chronic illness. And then even in recent studies, they've shown that diversity in the microbiome is linked to longevity. So the longer you live is determined by the diversity in your microbiome. So diversity is one thing. We'll talk about what you can do to increase diversity. The second part is keystone strains. So it's been identified there are certain types of bacteria within the microbiome that can be predominant in certain sections of the microbiome that are considered to be keystone. The reason why they're considered to be keystone is because they're really important in holding up the structure of the rest of the microbiome. They're also really important in protecting the host. So one of the examples of a keystone strain is Akkermansia muciniphila. Akkermansia muciniphila is a keystone strain that can make up to 5% of your total microbiome, which is a huge proportion of a single bacteria, because your microbiome can have up to 1,000 bacteria in it, right? So one bacteria being 5% of the total population is a very significant microbe. Now, Akkermansia has been shown in hundreds of studies, both in animal studies and human studies, to be inversely correlated with everything under the metabolic syndrome umbrella. And that's almost 60 different diseases, right? Things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, dementia, all of those things fall under cardiometabolic syndrome umbrella. And Akkermansia is inversely correlated to it, meaning if you have high levels of Akkermansia, you are significantly protected from everything in the cardiometabolic space. Also, they've been able to show with interventional studies that you can actually reverse the process of diabetes by adding in or increasing Akkermansia. That's how important it is. Also, it plays a significant role in leanness in the body, the amount of visceral fat, and so on. The other one that's very well known is Faecalibacterium bacterioprosnitzi. Faecalibacterium bacterioprosnitzi is so important that it's inversely correlated with numerous inflammatory conditions, especially inflammatory bowel conditions like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, or even colorectal cancer. There's also numerous studies that show that your ability to recover from cancer like melanoma and other types of cancers, especially using immunotherapy, is dictated by the amount of Faecalibacterium bacterioprosnitzi you have in your gut. So that's another really important keystone strain. So those are the two most well-established characteristics of a healthy gut. Number one is diversity in the microbiome, and number two is the presence of these keystone strains. So that's what we've been focusing on. So let's talk about how we can increase those, right? So the first thing, increasing diversity in the microbiome, the biggest influence is their diet. So having a diverse diet is going to impart a diverse microbiome. So our ancestors ate around 600 different types of foods annually, right? They foraged, they hunted, they gathered, they basically ate things like nuts and seeds and roots and tubers and insects and, fruits and animals, all types of animals. And so their diets were extremely diverse, and that caused this co-evolution of a very diverse microbiome. And our microbiome now is designed to accept a huge diversity of foods. I mean, humans are essentially omnivores, right? We can eat almost anything and do well with it. And so that's the biggest part. Now, the average American eats about 15 different types of foods. So we've dramatically shrunk our diversity, right? So one of the things I tell people is one of the easiest things you can do to improve your health outcomes and your microbiome is to increase the diversity in your diet. And one of the easiest ways to do that is, go to an ethnic grocery store that's somewhere in your neighborhood. Like I have a Middle Eastern grocery store and a huge Korean grocery store called H Mart. And they have vegetables there and roots and tubers and fruits that you'll never find at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or your conventional stores. And each of those fruits and vegetables have different carbohydrate structures that feed different types of bacteria in your system. And you don't have to make a complex Middle Eastern meal or a complex Asian meal. You can just buy one or two of those things, chop up parts of them, and put them in a salad or toss them with olive oil, or however you eat your other vegetables, you can just add those in. It's about eating a little bit of a lot of different things. And my challenge to people always is to add something new into your diet every week. Just one new thing, a nut or a seed or a root or that you would never eat or never have eaten before. Add a small amount of it into your diet each week. That will make a significant impact on your overall diversity in the microbiome. The other one is with the probiotics that we work with, the spores. So we work with these bacterial endospores, which are naturally environmental bacteria, which seem to be able to orchestrate a healthy microbiome population. We just submitted a study that's going to be published in a couple of months that shows that when you add the spores into your microbiome, it increases the diversity of your microbiome by almost 40 to 50%. Right. So what it's doing, and remember, diversity is measured as not only richness in terms of the number of microorganisms, but also uniformity of the organisms, right? So what the bacterial spores are doing is they're going in, they're reading the microbial environment, something called quorum sensing, and where they find overgrown or pathogenic organisms, they actually can sit next to them, produce upwards of 20 antibiotics or antimicrobials, and bring their levels down. And then they also produce all of these prebiotics to help regrow your minimized part of the microbiome. So they reestablish that uniformity and balance within the population. So in a 3-week study that we did, we saw between a 40 to 50% increase in the prevalence of strains that were previously undetectable in the microbiome. Right. So
that's with your product.
That's with our product, the Megaspore Biotic, and then the multi-spore blend. And then when we added in a prebiotic, so we work with these oligosaccharide prebiotics that we call precision prebiotics. not only did we see diversity continue to increase, but then we started to see these keystone strains that I talked about, the Akkermansia and the Fecalum bacteria. We started to see those grow at really dramatic levels. We're talking about 1,000-fold increase in the population of those keystone strains. So imagine they went from about 10 million cells per gram of stool to 10 billion cells per gram of stool. Again, this is just in a 3-week period. And those are the microbes, remember, that protect us against chronic illness. So aside from removing the toxigenic things from your environment, so eliminating the processed foods as much as you can that have all these preservatives and antimicrobials in it, using less chlorine-based cleaners in your household. I basically clean my house with a cloth and water, and in the water we add a few drops of essential oils just to give it a nice smell, because most surfaces in your house you don't need to sterilize, and nor is it good for you to do that. And then also, reducing your exposure to pesticides and herbicides by going more organic with your food choices. Those things are really important for the elimination side, but for the addition side, the best things you can do is increase the diversity in your diet, add in some spores, and adding some prebiotics.
That's fascinating. The spores, are they generally safe for everyone?
Yeah, so they're a normal commensal part of your microbiome. They exist. Everybody has around 1,000 CFUs of these spores per gram of stool naturally in your gut anyway. But they are a ubiquitous organism that's in the environment that we've been consuming for literally millions of years. There are these really significant glacial ice core studies that have been done in the Tibetan Plateau and the South Pole and North Pole, where they've pulled out ice core samples from glacial ice, looking at what microbes were in the environment 1.5, 2, 3 million years ago, and they find these spores that were prevalent in the environment at that time, and those spores had 95% genetic homology or better to the ones that exist today. So we've been exposed to these and been consuming these in a symbiotic way for millions of years throughout the course of human evolution. And on top of that, these spores have actually been in the prescription drug space since 1952. They've been a prescription probiotic in Europe, Asia, and parts of Latin America since the 1950s, and they were used to treat gut infections before antibiotics were used to treat gut infections. And in fact, in some countries, they're still the most prevalent use of a treatment for gut infections over an antibiotic.
So I'm assuming the more sensitive population, like pregnant women and infants, could take this because it's already commensal.
Absolutely, yeah. Not only can they take this, they should. I mean, pregnant women are going to impart their microbiome to their child, right? So it becomes extremely important for pregnant women to ensure that they have a healthy, diverse microbiome before they deliver, because that is what you're giving your child. All of the child's, health outcomes are going to be determined in large part by the microbiome that the mom provides to the child. So it becomes absolutely essential for mom to ensure that she has a healthy, functioning microbiome. And then with infants, one of the things that interests me all the time is looking at human behavior and evolutionary biology and looking at things that are ingrained in us. One of the interesting behaviors of every infant that's born still to this day is they sample their environment with their mouth. Right? They have this interesting tendency to put everything in their mouth. And I always question, why is that? Because as humans, our primary sensory organs are not our mouth. It's our eyes. We are tactile, we are visual, we are auditory. And so why is it that a newborn baby and an infant samples the environment with their mouth? Well, if you think about, an ancestral baby is born and put in the dirt, that baby's picking up rocks and dirt and dried dung and things like that and sampling and putting it into their system, because as it turns out, studies show that the exposure to these types of spore bacteria early on in life, not only does that, of course, improve your immune response, it actually helps develop your immune tissue in your gut. And we know that 80% of the immune tissue is in the gut. So early exposure to these types of organisms is not only natural, safe, it seems to be extremely important for the function of your immune system and your microbiome.
Let's change tack a little bit. One of your company's focuses is on mitochondria, and talk to us about the relationship a bit about mitochondria to the microbiome, and why that's even relevant and important.
Yeah, so that's a really great thing to bring up, and I don't often get to talk about it in microbiome talk, so I'm glad you brought it up. So mitochondria, of course, are the powerhouse of our cells. Every cell in our body, except for red blood cells, have mitochondria, and they can have anywhere between 4 and 2,400 mitochondria in a single cell. Your muscular cell, your skeletal muscle cells, for example, will have high numbers of mitochondria because they have to produce so much energy. Mitochondria also determine whether or not the cell stays alive or dead, and how functional is the cell. So aging and age-related disorders are heavily tied to the function of mitochondria in the cells. There was this great study that was published, I believe, in 2013 that took tissue samples from a 5-year-old and a 95-year-old and sent them to pathologists to try to compare the tissue samples and then figure out, to some degree, figure out which one is the 5-year-olds and which one is the 95-year-olds. And the only difference they could find in the samples between a 5-year-old and 95-year-old was the number of functional mitochondria in the cells. Mm-hmm. The 5-year-old would have about 100% of the mitochondria optimally functioning. The 95-year-old had up to 90% of the mitochondria in their cells dysfunctional. Right? And that was the only cellular difference. That's the reason why a 5-year-old has boundless energy, is basically bouncing off the walls all day long with eating tiny amounts of food, and why a 95-year-old has a really hard time getting out of bed. That's the fundamental difference when it comes down to our cells. And as it turns out, bacteria are ancient mitochondria, and our mitochondria came from bacteria. And so the way a mitochondria functions is heavily dictated by bacteria themselves. So a large part of it is there's something called the mitochondria muscle microbiome axis. And that is the largest store of mitochondria in your body are going to be in your muscles, in your skeletal muscles, in your heart, in your smooth muscle cells. And the ability of those muscles to replicate and produce more mitochondria are dictated by certain compounds that are produced in the microbiome itself, things like myokines. And then of course the inflammation that may or may not be generated within the microbiome. If you have a healthy microbiome, the inflammation is stopped. If you have an unhealthy microbiome, you have leaky gut and you have significant inflammation. That inflammation drives mitochondrial dysfunction in the cells as well. So there is this intimate connection there between having a healthy microbiome that can induce more production and repair of your mitochondria, and then you have a dysfunctional microbiome that can drive damage to the mitochondria through inflammation as well. So there's that intimate connection, and ultimately the health of your microbiome will dictate how functional your mitochondria are in large part. And then, of course, we know that then dictates how we function in general.
One of the interesting threads that I got pulled down around K2, looking at like one of your products that it's got K2 in it, K27 to be specific, is around the natto study, and how actually what was fermenting the soybeans was the bacillus spores, the same ones that you guys have in in your product that are making this K27 that are imparting this massive benefit. And so that you can look at it two ways. You can take that exogenously as a food source, but also you can colonize these things more so in your gut to produce them endogenously.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I became very interested in K2, became a passion project for me almost 15 years ago, and really it came from the fermentation of these spores, because a byproduct of fermentation and growing these spores is vitamin K2. And it's Bacillus subtilis natto that is the main organism that creates the K2 in the natto, as you said. And so the bacillus, the endospores that we work with, are the highest natural producers of vitamin K2. And vitamin K2 plays a very significant role in the health of the mitochondria because it sits in what we call complex 2 of the electron transport chain and dictates how much ATP or energy molecule your mitochondria can actually produce. CoQ10 is very well studied for that type of function as well. So CoQ10 is well known and prevents against heart disease and all this stuff because it sits in the mitochondria and makes sure that the cell generates enough energy so it doesn't die off. K2 seems to do it even better than CoQ10, and K2 is largely produced by these spores. And so that aspect of the tie, I'm glad you brought that up, is also really interesting and intimate. And vitamin K2 is a absolutely essential nutrient for us in many different ways.
Yeah, we're just about out of time. Do you have a moment for another question, or do you need to go?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Well, my question is, I recently interviewed someone talking about mast cell activation syndrome, and I had not heard of that until this interview. And as I started to look into it more, there is a major component of this whole activation really is histamine and histamine release, and that we have an enzyme, a DAO enzyme, in the gut that helps break down some of these histamines. But for various reasons, it can become low, or we have too much histamine production. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about, have you come across research? Do you have any thoughts about gut health and this syndrome and histamines?
Yeah, so there's two aspects to it, and it's a very complex topic actually, and there's lots of good studies coming out on it to try to figure out some of the mechanisms of action that involve this mast cell activation. But the two simplistic aspects of it are that histamine is a common messenger molecule that the microbiome uses to indicate to your immune system that there is an infection going on. Right, so your microbiome actually produces large amounts of histamine, and so if you have a chronic infection in your mucosa, for example, you've got a chronic viral infection or bacterial infection, then there are components of your microbiome that are going to continuously be sending out this histamine signal to try to indicate to your immune cells that, hey, there's an infection here, you need to do something about it. So that's one of the aspects of it, because we have this dysfunctional microbiome and we allow lots of chronic latent infections to persist in our bodies for long periods of time, we now have a microbiome that's continuously producing histamine and overproducing it, if you will, in order to try to signal the infection to the immune system. So that's one aspect of it. So you get too much histamine, and then you end up with this continuous mast cell activation. Then the second part of it is the breakdown part, which you mentioned, the enzyme. Now, it's unclear which microbes produce that enzyme to break down histamine to control the levels. But in general, when you have low diversity in your microbiome, you're going to have a low level of production of these types of enzymes. And so because we don't exactly know which organisms are the ones producing it, the best way to protect against it is to increase the diversity within your microbiome so that you have more of those players that have that function of breaking down the histamine so that it doesn't get overabundant in the microbiome. So you can think of it as a imbalance issue where, because you have low diversity to begin with, now you have a higher rate of chronic infections in your microbiome. That higher rate of chronic infections is triggering the microbiome to release histamine signals to tell your immune system that, hey, we've got a chronic infection. At the same time, that same low diversity, which allowed the chronic infection in the first place, also has low levels of production of the enzyme to break down the histamine once the signals have been sent. And so it's a mix of both of those. So in my view, one of the best things we can do, because we don't want to go in and start inhibiting the function of mast cells and so on, which is kind of the pharma approach of doing that. They go, oh, mast cells are a problem, let's knock out mast cells. Well, no, mast cells are also really important for all types of protection against environmental issues. But one of the best ways, in my view, that we could probably do that is by rebalancing the microbiome, because it seems to be the central player in all of this.
Yeah, because that is one approach, is to work on eliminating foods that produce histamines, which has this shrinking of diversity affect them because you are eating a very restrictive diet, yet there are some bacteria that, like you said, produce more histamine. And some of them have noted, in fact, I think that even, was it Clausi, Bacillus clausi is one of them. And so there's a sort of, would you say that it's worth taking the short-term histamine increase to produce a longer-term microbiome diversity, which would then lower that histamine? Is that kind of a good, is that appropriate to even think of it that way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you can take some things to try to quench the physiological response to the histamines, things like quercetin, and there are even some OTC things that you can take antihistamines if you need to. But at the end of the day, if you're really going to resolve the problem, then you do have to go to the root cause, which is the diversity part. You know, so you may have to go through a process, a portion of being more uncomfortable to get to that root cause. Everything else, you know, beyond that, it just you know, doing the elimination diets and reducing your intake of dietary components significantly, you know, or using anything that inhibits mast cell function as a long-term solution. All of those are band-aids, you know, and the condition will likely just kind of continue to get worse. And I've seen them work with a lot of people who are in this, and they eliminate their diet to, you know, 8 things that they can eat. Then next thing you know, it's 6 things and 4 things. And, you know, before you know it, they're only eating 3 things that doesn't cause this huge response in their system. And we know that long-term, you know, reduction of the diversity in your diet will have other consequences as well. So, you know, to me, you really have to address the microbiome side of it to fix the true part of the problem.
Thank you so much for your time. If listeners, viewers want to get more, that microbiomelabs.com, right? That's your site.
That's a website. Yeah, come on there. There's a blog that's attached with lots of articles. There are webinars on there that you can listen on very specific topics associated with the microbiome. And as you mentioned in the beginning, you know, going to YouTube, even if you just put my name in there or Microbiome Labs, you'll find, you know, dozens and dozens of videos on there on various interviews on very specific topics on the microbiome. We're very focused on education and research. Those are our 2 biggest passions. So we've got 14 clinical trials going on right now, and you know, and I speak at 50 different conferences a year, and then not to mention, you know, the opportunity that I get to do all these types of podcasts and webinars as well. So, you know, come out there and look for us and look for all the information. And at the end of the day, the future of healthcare to me is people being empowered with knowledge and information about how their body works and how the world around them affects them. You know, we have to advocate for ourselves. So that's why these types of programs to me are extremely important. So thank you for doing what you do. And thank you for having me on to get to talk about this.